So, with that, I want to thank you for coming today to this virtual program about the Eagles of Heart Mountain by Bradford Pearson. We are going to have a really wonderful conversation, and for that, I'm going to turn it over to Erin Aoyama, who is one of our uh, curatorial assistants at JANM, as well as a PhD student at Brown University, and just a really wonderful community member. So handing it over to you, Erin, take it away. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Joy. You took my introduction to myself, but I'm so excited to be here. Thank you for asking me. And Brad, thanks for joining us. It's great to see some familiar names in the attendance list. As Joy mentioned, my name is Erin Aoyama. I'm a PhD candidate in American Studies at Brown University, and I'm a current curatorial assistant at JANM. And I'm so delighted to be in conversation today with Bradford Pearson, who is the author of The Eagles of Heart Mountain. Just a quick sort of background bio on Brad. Brad's the former features editor of Southwest the magazine. He's written for the New York Times, Esquire, Time, and Salon, among many other publications. And he grew up in Hyde Park, New York, and now lives in Philadelphia. So Brad, thank you so much for being here, still in this virtual world. And I guess to get us started, I know you will often talk and begin with sort of background on a lot of the history that informs this book, which many of us in attendance are familiar with. So maybe today, instead, you could start with telling us a little bit about the book itself and sort of the overall story, some of the main wonderful characters that you get to know and the sort of major threads and themes throughout for folks who maybe just ordered their copy from the JANM store to get a little bit of a preview of what's in this fantastic book.
Sure. Well, thank you all for coming, and for Erin and Joy and everyone else behind the scenes at JANM for having me. The Eagles of Heart Mountain is the story of the greatest high school football team in the history of state of Wyoming, which is a group of incarcerated Japanese American teenagers at the Heart Mountain camp in Northwest Wyoming. The book, what I attempted to do with the book was use the football team as a way to tell the story of not only Japanese American incarceration, but sort of Japanese American life leading up to the war as well, because I thought that the football team served as a really good opportunity to teach a broader audience about Japanese American life and this period of incarceration. So what I wanted to do was really use the players, so folks like Babe Nomura, Horst Yoshinaga, Kichi Ikeda, Teizo Matsumoto, Stanigawa, Tosha Sano, all these different players that come through the story of the book. I wanted to use that story to sort of tell this broader story. And I thought that, you know, as a white American and somebody who's not a member of the Japanese American community, I thought that using football would sort of allow this book to ideally to reach people like me, you know, people that weren't as familiar with the story of Japanese American incarceration, maybe hadn't learned about it as much in school, or and definitely didn't have a family connection to this period of time. And, you know, so that was why I thought that, you know, because originally I came across the story of the Eagles, the football team. So that was the angle that I came to it from. I didn't come to it from learning about incarceration. So by learning this small story about the Eagles, I really thought that it would allow me to sort of open up what I could possibly write this book about. So that was sort of my thinking going into writing it.
Yeah, and I think one of my favorite parts about this book is that even as folks who know about incarceration or know about Japanese American history or are Japanese American, there's this way of learning about, you know, a football team or all of the sports teams that existed at Heart Mountain and other camps. That's like that's not, if you know, if you get a paragraph in your history textbook, that's not the paragraph you're getting. So it is a really, I think, wonderful story in so many ways, and just a reminder of also the normalcy of life that attempted to progress for all of the sort of bumps along the way, as an understatement, of course. So I do think it's a really fantastic way in. And I guess I want to ask you a little bit more about what brought you to this story. I know you sort of learned about the Eagles, but then what made you come back to it, I guess, and really want to make this a full book and spend years of your life doing this research?
Yeah, so that's a really good question in that. So for folks who don't know, I basically saw the story of the Eagles. I was working on a different story. I was in Northwest Wyoming working on a story about Yellowstone National Park. And I went to the Heart Mountain Interpretive Center one day, and that was where I was first introduced to the Eagles. There's a small mention of them on one of the displays in the museum, and it sort of stuck in my head when I went home and wrote this story about Yellowstone. And I wouldn't think about it, a week would pass or a month or a year, and I just couldn't stop getting this idea of this Japanese American football team out of my head, and I couldn't really put that down. And every time I would work on another story, I would just sort of have that in the back of my mind, and think that that's something that I should really focus my time on. And then, not to put too fine a point on it, but then Donald Trump got elected president. And at the time, I was the features editor for Southwest's In-Flight magazine. And in that role, you don't really have too much flexibility to sort of politicize the work that you do and the sort of stories that you write and the stories that you edit or you allow into your magazine. We tried to find some ways to sort of do that, but we couldn't. So I thought, okay, maybe there's a way to use my skill set to tell this story that I felt was unfortunately timely due to the Trump administration's policies and the things that they were trying to put into law. And that was when I really started working on the Eagles of Heart Mountain as a book, because I really thought that this was a story that would resonate with lots of people and still teach Americans about this history that they need to know. And that was when I really started cranking on it, was after, probably in early 2017 was when I started reading up more about the Eagles. I reached out to the Heart Mountain Foundation, and they were able to put me in touch with Bacon Sakatani, who sent me copies of every single copy of the Heart Mountain Sentinel weekly newspaper. And that was when I was really able to start figuring out who the best players were on the Eagles and sort of getting a sense of just how dominant this football team was. Because based on this small mention of them at the Heart Mountain Museum, I knew that they were a good team, but I had no real context beyond, just how good they were or how many games they played or kind of competition that they played. Even how many players they had on the team. I knew nothing beyond that because, it's a museum. Like, a museum is not expected to give you all the information that exists about a topic. So that was when I really started diving into it, was in 2017. And I started reaching out to the families. I started reaching out to Babe Nomura's family, his daughter, Jan Mori, and she really started getting things rolling when she gave me the okay to start, just even to ask more about her father and her family and their time in camp. And then she, reached out to George Yoshinaga's family on my behalf and said that, Brad seems reasonably legit. And then it sort of, everything snowballed from there. And then I started attending the Heart Mountain pilgrimages, which is when, for me at least, there's sort of academic and professional interest in the story. And then when the first time I went to the pilgrimage, that's when I really got sort of an emotional resonance. And that was when I knew, okay, this is a story not only that I want to tell, but I feel like I really need to tell because people need to hear it.
Mm. Yeah, and I want to come back to that because I do think one of the most powerful parts of the book are these characters that are so fleshed out, and like it feels like you knew them personally, and I know that's not the case for most of them. So we'll come back to that. But I think I read in the Discover Nikkei article or interview with you that Jan had Googled you and called your employer to make sure you were legit, which I love, because really, like you went into this community and wanted to tell this story in a way that I think is really personal and meaningful. So, okay, I want to ask about the research that you did, because we've sort of talked around it, and I know just from reading this and from being a researcher myself, just how much research went into this to be able to tell this story that you tell in this really detailed, really sort of in-depth history that also is this really compelling narrative in so many ways. So can you talk a little bit about your process as a writer and as a researcher? What did research look like for you? How did you keep these all of this, you're talking on a macro level about World War
Right.
II and sort of what's happening in the world. And then on this very micro level of families and sort of intergenerational stories and coming of age stories. So what questions did you sort of approach your research with? How did you use these different kinds of sources? That's like 5 questions in one. So whatever you want, and I'm happy to ask.
Well, in a similar fashion, I'd say my research was also fairly ramshackle in that you start thinking about something and then you get excited about it and you start working on it before you actually figure out how you're going to arrange all your research, how you're going to tell this story. So you start gathering, a room's full of information for like a coaster's worth of a book. So you have to take all of this stuff. So for me, it was very early on. The very first things I did was I read every issue of the Heart Mountain Sentinel from start to finish. So all the years that the camp was open, every week that the newspaper existed, I read all of those newspapers start to finish, because I knew that while I wanted sort of the main narrative to be about this football team and those families and those characters, I knew that the book would suffer if I didn't have the full context of what was going on at camp every day. So even if that was, not just the main headlines saying like, oh, there's a strike in the dining hall, or they put up more barbed wire or things like that, I wanted to know, like, on a very granular level, what day-to-day life was like. And the example that I always come back to on this is that there's a very small, it's maybe a sentence in the book, maybe not even a full sentence, about how some of the women in the camp picked wild mustard greens from the area outside of camp and pickled them into sukemono. And I think about that, and that the only reason that I knew that that happened was because it was like a 1-inch brief in one part of a back issue of the Sentinel. And that was the kind of detail that I knew that I wanted to bring to the book, because I think that there's a lot of books that are written, I won't say exactly what they are, but there was a book that came out from a very famous white author a few years ago about incarceration that I read, and I didn't really like it that much because I felt like it spent too much time on a macro level and not enough time on that micro level where you actually get to learn about people and day-to-day life and what the things were that folks did every day in camp. It just sort of hit on the big history moments. And while it was a good book for giving me an idea of what all this history was, I had no sense of really what was going on in camp on a day-to-day basis. So then once I did all of that reading with the Sentinel, then it became me, starting to reach out to the family, starting to reach out to Babe Nomura's family and George Oshinaga's family, and interviewing Kichi Ikeda and getting those family stories in line. But then it was also at Janum, Densho, and Heart Mountain Archives, UCLA, Berkeley, was finding as many oral histories as I could, not just from people who I wanted to write about in the book, but anyone who had been at Heart Mountain. And I would just sit there and I would read them first. And then if there were sections that I was really interested in, I would watch the oral history videos and listen to them to see how each of those people was recounting their life from Heart Mountain in that point. Because I wanted to see from their point of view whether that was something, if I was applying an emotion to that situation or to that story that was there or not necessarily there. After I got my book contract, I sat on my couch for like 3 straight months and just read. I read books, newspapers, academic journals, all those oral histories. I didn't write for probably 3 or 4 months after I got my book contract, which seems kind of counterintuitive. But for me, I knew that, especially as someone from outside of the Japanese American community, that I needed to be incredibly confident in the material that I was writing, and not just from a big picture level in terms of how I was going to flesh out the story and how I was going to structure it, but on a sentence to sentence level, I needed to be able to sit there and write for 10 minutes, a half hour, an hour straight, and not feel like I was spending every minute flipping open a book, double checking that what I was writing was accurate. And of course, I cited everything in the book. Like, it's a 400-page book and only 300 pages are the actual text of the book. So it's 100 pages of notes. So I obviously was going back and making sure that I was citing everything and making sure that it was factually accurate. But I knew that if I had, 95% of that in my head, it would make the writing on a sentence to sentence and paragraph to paragraph level just so much better, because I was confident in knowing that what I was writing was the right thing. So yeah, and then like you said, it's like sort of trying to get down on a personal level too, is that every character that I had in the book, sometimes I feel bad calling them characters because they're real people, but in this sense, in like a narrative sense, they are the characters that drive this book through. So I had an independent file that I kept on each player, and then I had independent files based on every year that camp was open. And then within those files, I had events and timelines and things that I knew that I needed to hit. But then I also had whole separate files that were just, I called them color files, which were just interesting tidbits that I would find along the way, like the sukemono thing, or some food that was being served, or some little tidbit of information that I knew I wanted to add into the story to really fill out those day-to-day lives, whether it was before the war or during the war. And that was really helpful for me in terms of structuring and figuring out how I actually wanted things to work. The most important thing for me, though, still was I made this massive timeline with every date that I wanted to, every event that I thought was important in the book, I put it on there. So whether it was a game, once the draft resistance movement started, I put every court appearance, I put everything in there. I put every time someone came into camp, every time somebody left camp, somebody's draft physical day, the days that every single one of the families was evacuated and removed from their homes. I put that in, and dates all the way back to the first Japanese person to ever come to North America. Like it was every date for, I mean, I think I added one dumb one that was like 68 million years ago about like what Wyoming was like then. But for mostly it was like 1500 to like 1990. So it ended up being whatever, 1,000 different dates. And what that really helped me do was helped me to figure out how events happening in Heart Mountain were also interacting with events happening outside of Heart Mountain. So where things were happening in the war, or where things were happening in Washington, D.C. So I could actually like keep this timeline accurate. And that for me was really important in terms of figuring out, football was only played in the fall. So my biggest thing when I got to Heart Mountain was knowing that I was going to need to fill out a book that didn't just exist in the fall, right? So like, I knew that I was going to have to find events that were happening in the fall, winter, spring, and summer in order to keep the reader engaged. And by building that timeline was when I realized that the draft resistance movement at Heart Mountain and the football season at Heart Mountain almost operated on separate schedules, in terms of the draft resistance movement would start or restart every spring and then sort of come to a head in the fall when the football season was happening. So that really helped me fill out those chapters and just being able to go back and forth. And that wouldn't have been possible if I hadn't built out this timeline. Sometimes people that are working on their first book, this is my first book too. So sometimes when people are working on their book, they're like, oh, do you have like any advice? I was like, just build a timeline, and whatever you can hang off of that timeline is that it's super important.
That's awesome. That's so interesting to hear, and I'd love to see that timeline at some point. Maybe
sure, yeah,
published as a accompanying your book, because one of the pieces that I found most effective and also made me realize quite how much research had gone into this was the way that you flip back and forth between, especially in the sort of early part of the book, the histories of these families coming to the United States in the first place, and then the sort of lead up to Pearl Harbor, all sort of happening alongside of each other, which I found really effective, because it shows you like all of this is shaping the experiences of these individuals and their families, but also what's happening in a broader scale in California and along the West Coast and elsewhere. And there is mention, I think, of Rhode Island or New Bedford, Massachusetts, just close to
New Bedford. Yeah, well, that's like some of the Manjiro stuff is like, so like the very first Japanese man to sort of be in the United States. Because I thought that sort of context is important too, because I mean, I'm speaking to a broadly Japanese American audience right now. So I don't have to say that the place of Asian Americans in the United States has always been sort of unsettled in a way that people don't think of for white Americans or Black Americans, especially. And I think that what I wanted to do with giving sort of the deep history on that was to say, you know, Asian Americans have been here for hundreds and hundreds of years. This is not a new group in America. These are not things that are new. These are not, the effects of this are not new, and white Americans shouldn't be thinking of Asian Americans as, you know, quote, new Americans. So that's why I wanted to add all of that depth. But I'm glad that you picked up on, like, I was trying really hard to still keep, even going through the broader history of Japanese American life and leading up to incarceration, I still wanted to find small ways to incorporate the families that I was going to be writing about later in the book into that time period, and sort of giving people the sense like, oh, this is when Babe Nomura's father arrived in America. This is when George Yoshinaga's father arrived in America. Here's what they were doing. And that's how that plays into the broader picture of whether that's the development of a Japanese American neighborhood in Hollywood, or the development of Japanese American farmers in the South San Francisco Bay Area. Because I wanted to sort of the people to think like, oh, these young men that this is happening to in 1944 when they're playing football, are the seeds of that were planted when their fathers arrived in 1906 or 19, you know, whatever year that they came. So that's what I was trying to do, was sort of, you know, give the long story of these families, then connect them to the history that they really helped create.
Yeah, which as a reader and as a Japanese American was fun, because I think about that all the time, of trying to sort of pull the threads of my family and how they ended up at Heart Mountain, who they were when they ended up there. And so to have this sort of one way of tracing through that, through the folks that you're focusing on, was fun. So
I think that I also had a little bit more freedom as a non-Japanese American to write in that way, and sort of say, and sort of lay things out very plainly. And just sort of, because I was writing to an audience of broadly Americans as opposed to Japanese Americans, I think that I was able, even through like my editorial process and my writing process, to sort of say like, here's everything you need to know, and not feel like a Japanese, if it was just for a Japanese American audience, be like, oh, people be like, oh, I already know this. But I knew that there was still going to be some value in it for, hopefully, for some Japanese American readers too, that I was giving this much broader history because I was trying to reach a big, broad audience.
Right, which I think I remember the first time I met you, or you were pointed out to me at the Heart Mountain pilgrimage, someone was like, oh, that's Brad, he's writing the football book. But when I read this book, obviously it's about football, but it's about, there is a way that you could read just this book, and that's the only thing you would read about Japanese American incarceration, and you'd get a much bigger picture of, you know,
thank you.
The war. Like, yeah, I mean, I do think it's really effective, and that history you go through in the first part is quite thorough and detailed, but still engaging as something to read. And I'm wondering, did you know what kind of story you wanted to tell when you started this? I know it was about the Eagles. It was sort of this, you know, Donald Trump 2017 moment, but what were you imagining that story would be, and what changed, or maybe what surprised you along the way of writing this?
Yeah, I definitely didn't think that the history sections were going to be as long as they were. And some people have said that they should be shorter, but some people, you know, it's funny when, you know, you're not supposed to read reviews of your book, but I do because I'm a narcissist. But then like you get some of these reviews and some people say, oh, you shouldn't have, like, having so much history up front takes away from the narrative. And there's other people that were like, oh, actually didn't need to read any of the football stuff. He should have just written a history book about Japanese American history. And I was like, okay, well, I feel like if both of those people think that, I probably landed somewhere in the middle and it was okay. But yeah, at the beginning, I definitely didn't think that those sections were going to be as long as they were. But then once I started getting into the research, I started thinking about what my misconceptions were about Japanese American incarceration, or, you know, my biggest misconception when I first started, Japanese internment, like the idea of what these words are that we use to describe this moment in American history. You know, those things, those kind of things, like terminology, changed very quickly for me. But then as you start researching it, slowly you start to think about the way that either you were taught this or how you conceived this period in time. So I think most people think of Japanese American incarceration as immediately being, Pearl Harbor happens, then this next thing happens. And what I wanted to do is try to erase that completely and give people all of the history that led up to it, to give them enough information to say, oh no, Pearl Harbor was just like the final event in this decades long history and chain of events, that eventually Pearl Harbor was just the one thing that like allowed the government to do things that they had wanted to do for decades anyway. So for me, that was one thing that really changed. Was while I was doing it, I realized that I had to focus more on the history to give people the fuller sense of why this happened. Because I knew that, in the back of my mind, I did feel this responsibility because this wasn't my community. So I had a responsibility from outside the Japanese American community to get this right for the Japanese American community. But then I also knew that I had a responsibility because, most people don't get book deals where they can have that be their job for 3 years. And I did. So I knew that I didn't want to fail that. And by having that sort of institutional support from Simon & Schuster, I knew that the book was going to be in lots of stores. I knew that lots of people would have the opportunity to read it. So I knew that I also had an opportunity to put all that history in there so that somebody that picked up the book thinking it was just going to be about football would then get all this history that maybe they hadn't learned before, and most likely hadn't learned before. So that's one big thing that changed for me when I was just like, okay, once it became real and it was like, okay, you have a book contract to write this book, then it became like, okay, how can I get as many people to read this book and to learn the things that I'm learning in the moment while I'm researching it, and to make them care about that. And then secondly, I didn't think there was going to be as much stuff about the draft resistance movement. But then once I realized that those two timelines kind of lined up in a way that allowed the last third of the book to sort of keep propelling in a way that I thought was dramatic, but dramatic because of the events that were happening in camp. Hi, guys. What am I doing? I'm here.
Yeah.
Hey, buddy. Okay.
You up there?
Okay.
Welcome back from
Okay.
Instagram.
Okay. But then, so then once I realized that, that's when I was like, okay, I need to learn more about the ins and outs of the draft resistance movement, because then eventually I was like, okay, these teenage boys on this team were having to make the same decisions as the people who were resisting the draft. In some cases, they were the draft resistors. So once I started thinking about it in that way and thinking of them not as two separate groups, but of the same group of young men in their late teens and early 20s, that's when everything sort of clicked for me for the last third of the book, and not thinking about them as separate stories, but thinking about them as the same story.
Yeah, which is such an interesting and I think compelling way to think about war and wartime service. And, we're 80 years out to the day from Pearl Harbor, this attack on Pearl Harbor. And it's, the stories we hear about World War II, it's easy to forget that the men that we celebrate who fought and the women who were involved, like they're kids, a lot of them, and going from the high school football field to deciding whether or not to show up for their induction physical. Yeah. I think that is a really interesting juxtaposition and shows a lot of the humanity behind this. As a historian, I love the fact that the history is foregrounded, because I think it's true. You understand so much more about the nuances by having that history there. So, okay, my last sort of process method question for now.
I mean, I could talk about it all day. I don't know if the audience wants to hear it all day.
Me too. And if no one's I'll just keep going, which is a plug to use the Q&A function, folks. But you mentioned in passing some of the archives that you used, and I'm wondering, since this is a talk through JANM, at JANM virtually, sort of what your relationship was to JANM while you were working on this book, maybe how you use their archives and collections, or any sort of favorite archival discoveries specifically from JANM.
Sure. So at JANM, I was only able to interview one living player, Kiichi Ikeda, and I did it at JANM in the library room there. So I always have a special spot in my heart, just thinking about that, the living connection that I was able to make in terms of the living player that I was able to speak with, I did at JANM. And that same day, Brian Nia's More Than a Game book and why can't I think of this museum word? Exhibit, yes, thank you. Which is from years ago. I had the book that I knew accompanied it, but when I reached out, when I first started doing it, I was like, do you all have any more information about this? And the archivists were able to pull the actual boxes of all of the planning documents leading up to it, which meant like every single edit for every story, for every part of the exhibit, for every sport. I mean, budgeting documents, stuff that I was like, okay, well, I clearly don't need to look at these budgeting documents, but even being able to do that and see those and see how the history of Japanese American sports and see it in this fully realized way, just in this box from start to finish, how this exhibit came to be was really grounding for me, especially when it comes to, because part of this book is about Japanese American sports, not just football, and about how athletics came to be important in this community. When the first Issei generation arrived in terms of the sports that they were playing, how baseball became a large part, and then how athletics and the Nisei Athletic Union in California, how important that was to the young men on the team. Those are the sort of things that I was able to really, sort of see just in this box that I pulled the top off and I was just pulling files out of. That was incredibly important. And I mean, just the work that JANM does on a day-to-day basis in terms of my general education on Japanese American history. Because for me, coming from outside of the Japanese American community, I grew up in New York, and there's not a large Japanese American community in New York, especially in the Hudson Valley. So where I grew up, it's just not a community that I had been introduced to on a personal level. So I came to this story from the Heart Mountain Eagles, the football team. So when I did that, I realized, okay, now you have to bring it out and I have to learn all of this information so I can tell this story. And, just general, and I mean, it sounds dumb, but just following JANM on Instagram and being like, oh, this is an interesting story. Here's what they're talking about. Here's the topics of conversation that are occurring in the Japanese American community today. And how do I respect those conversations, whether it's conversations on terminology or conversations about identity, and how do those come into play from a historic standpoint as well? So even just, little things that you kind of pick up through osmosis just by, doing a very mid-30s thing by scrolling through your phone was very important as well.
Yeah. I mean, the power really of JANM as this community-based, community-centered museum. Having been in the collections recently, I know how much is back there, and it's awesome to see that you got to go through that exhibit too, and just see sort of what had already existed.
And just thinking about JANM's place, its physical place in Little Tokyo too, and just knowing like what this community means, and thinking about what that community meant and what that community was in 1941, and thinking about the young men that are in the book that grew up in that neighborhood, and having a sense of place is really important to me as a reporter, even outside of this book. And I always try to establish that in all the stories that I write about. So for me, it was really important establishing a sense of place, not only at Heart Mountain, but then in Los Angeles beforehand. So when I would visit LA to do story research, I went to Santa Anita to the racetrack. I snuck in through the back so I could check out the horse stables. So I wanted to see what these stables were. And the stables haven't been changed since they housed 7,000 Japanese Americans and their families. So that was really important to me to sort of, it probably doesn't come through on a sentence level. There's not a sentence that I could point to in this book and say, oh, that's the sentence when I was in the horse stables. But it was important to me to be there and see that. I snuck into the boarding house that Babe Nomura's parents owned, which is an apartment building now. I went into the high school that Babe went to. I went onto the football field to get a sense of perspective as to what the buildings were around it at the time. And then everything at Heart Mountain. Every time I would go to Heart Mountain for research or for the pilgrimage, I would spend an hour by myself out in the field that Heart Mountain Interpretive Center and the foundation don't even own anymore, and just be by myself to try to think about what it must have been like to be a person and to, more importantly for my book, to be a teenage boy in this place. I'll go out sometimes when there were people there, I'll go out in the morning, and sometimes I'll go out in the middle of the night, and I would drive out there and I would stand out there in the middle of the dark and try to figure out what it must have felt like to be 17 years old, to be 1,000 miles away from any home you'd ever known, and to wonder what the rest of your life was going to be like, to wonder how long you're going to be in this camp. So for me, a sense of place is always really important.
Yeah, and I really appreciate that, because I think I found the ending of the book, like the closing, the literal last couple of paragraphs, so moving, because that's something about all of these sites that are connected to the history of incarceration, whether there's something there or not, and whether it looks the same as it did or it doesn't. There's so much, I don't know, history that you can sort of absorb or experience on a level that's not necessarily intellectual, but is important, I think, to really get at the reality of these folks' lives, and then also the way that that impacted them and all of us afterwards.
Yeah.
So I love the ending of your book. I think
Thanks. That last like 500 or 700 words or whatever it is, I wrote in one sitting, and then I think I only edited like 1 or 2 words. Like I felt like once I knew how I was going to do the ending, I didn't do any drafts. I didn't outline it. I just sat down and was like, okay, just imagine you're there and just write it. And I did. And I don't know, sometimes I read the end of the book and I'm like, I get emotional, because it's like, it's the end of this story of this book, but it's also, for me, it's the end of this project that I really loved doing with my whole heart for all the years that I worked on doing it. So for me, I guess, like personally, professionally, it's emotional for me too.
Yeah,
Like thinking about that.
It puts you back, you being the reader, back, and sort of makes this claim, whether this was your intention or not, that it mattered that this football team was here, and it mattered that, these people played and were kids and had these lives, and all these lives that happened around them. It matters even if you can't see it there anymore. It's still sort of that place, and I think that's important, for all of us to think about, even if we return to Heart Mountain often, or go, or have been, or not, to think about, like, yeah, just because something isn't there or you can't obviously see it doesn't mean that the stories that happen there don't matter.
Right.
So I appreciate that. I guess also we've sort of talked around this, but so many of these folks like Babe and Horse and Keiichi are so fleshed out and characters, but really feel like people that you're meeting. And I'm wondering how you approached sort of writing that interiority that comes through from them. I think a line about Babe like catching the football and running down the field and sort of being transported out of where he was at Heart Mountain at the time, which is really powerful. And then also was like, but how did you know? How are you know that he was thinking this? So yeah, I'm just wondering how you thought about the sort of interior lives of these characters, and how you used archival fragments and memories and family stories maybe to put these folks together and sort of give us a glimpse inside as much as you did.
Yeah, that was, for Keiichi, I was able to actually speak with Keiichi, but then for Babe, Horse, and Stanigawa especially, I relied so heavily on their families. So whether it was their children, their spouses, their siblings, even interactions that they had with other people within that community. I was able to interview folks from the Heart Mountain community too that knew these people. I was able to speak with one woman who knew all of the high school players, and we'd sit and talk for hours and hours. So that gave me a lot of context as to what their personalities were when they were kids, when they were teenagers, as opposed to what they might have been like, for hearing a child's, one of your children's perspectives of you is much different than hearing your spouse's perspective, a sibling's perspective, especially, and then just sort of like a friend's perspective. And then there was some other stuff like, George did a really, really extensive oral history that I was able to access. Stan did an oral history. Teizo Matsumoto did an oral history. So I was able to, and they were all from like the 70s. So I felt like they were accurate in a way. George is from a little bit later, but Teizo's and Stan's were from a while ago. And those really helped me give, obviously some insight into what they were like, their lives were like in camp. And beyond that, one of the biggest things was that Stanigawa's family, the very first time I ever met them was at the first Heart Mountain pilgrimage I ever went to. And when I told them what I was interested in doing, at that point, Stan wasn't even a main character in the book because Stan didn't play that much on the team. And I was sort of focusing, probably in hindsight, wrongly, on the best players because I thought that I had the most information about them as players. But then once I started talking with Stanigawa's family and thought about Stan's story as coming from Hawaii to California and thinking just the thing I think I always think about with Stan is that if him and his brother had never moved back to California, he would have never been incarcerated if he had just lived in Hawaii. So I think about what his life would have been like if his family hadn't made that one decision. But then I start, just like with all the other families, I started talking after the pilgrimage with Stan's children, and they told me that Stan had, before he died, written a short memoir. And they incredibly gratefully sent it to me. And I was able to find so many like robust details about Stan's life that so much of the chapter where we first meet Stan is based on his own writing and based on his own reflections of his life and his time in camp, in which he never actually mentions the football team. So his life in camp was so full in so many other ways that sort of opened my eyes to think about what were these young men doing outside of the football field. I also relied pretty heavily on photos. So in the Heart Mountain yearbooks, in the Heart Mountain archives, in the Washington State archives, that they have, and the National Archives have so many photos of Heart Mountain that I really relied heavily on those in terms of giving me a sense of what high school life was like, what style was like, even just you can get so much of a person's character out of how they approach a camera and how they look at a camera and how they pose for a camera or don't pose for a camera, if they smile or they don't smile. And there's a line in the book about how Babe Nomura like very rarely smiles. And then later on, I was once with his daughter and his wife, and they told me it's because he was always embarrassed of his teeth. So like, there's little things like that you can sort of, you have to take all of these little fragments of things, these, an image here and a snippet of a chat with someone there and sort of piece together this. And that sort of tells a lot about a person, that they spent most of their life not smiling for photos, even though to their friends and family, they were known as a funny, gregarious guy because they didn't like the way their teeth looked for whatever reason. Yeah. So you can really, so for me, because I was working on a story that happened 75 years before I came to it, you rely so much not only on the historical record, but then also just on the kindness of literal strangers. You rely on the kindness of these families and people that you randomly just meet at a Heart Mountain pilgrimage. And I would sit down with Raymond Uno and just say, hey, do you remember any of these guys? And if not, tell me what life was like as an 8-year-old in camp and what these athletes meant to an 8-year-old to think about what their place in camp was in terms of how an 8-year-old might have looked up to a football player that was 16, 17, 18 years old. So yeah. I really appreciate that you think the characters are well fleshed out, because it was really hard to do. And it spent a lot of time. And, for me, it just spent a lot of time with these families, especially the Nomura family. Whenever I would visit LA, I would stay with Jan and her husband, Jack. And you even just like pick up little things in conversation while you're having breakfast or in the car with someone that you're not interviewing this person. I did some sit down interviews with the families, but a lot of times it's just talking on the phone with someone or spending time with these families. And occasionally they would, especially Babe's widow, would occasionally just sort of remember something. We'd be sitting at dinner and she would say something that is in the book, but we were just eating dinner in a restaurant. So I think that so much of this book was just literally trying to spend as much time as I possibly could before these people got sick of me.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think it's such a good reminder when, we think about telling history, to remember that people in the past had lives that are as complex as our lives are today, and that
Oh,
it's impossible to capture all of that, obviously. But
mhm.
I do think the book does such a good job, partly because of using this sort of lens of football and then fleshing, going so much further than just that, but to show the way that there were these sort of normal little, high school stresses or family stresses that come up against a backdrop of all of this other sort of world drama that's going on at the same
Yeah.
time.
And for me, that was like, I realized pretty early on that a good way to tell this story was sort of speak to the universality of being a teenager, in that we've all been teenagers. There'd be very few people, I think, who have read this book that weren't teenagers, and kudos to those kids if they're getting through it. But like, so I thought, like, if there's a way to really flesh out what it must have been like to be a teenager, and even like little things that I think about, one of the things I think about a lot when it comes to the teenage experience with this book, it doesn't even happen in camp. It happens before camp, when Horse had to give away his sporting equipment to his friends before his family goes to Santa Anita. And I think about that a lot, because I think about not only what must have been like for Horse, but what it must have been like to be these two white kids to show up and be like, okay, I guess I'll take your bike and your basketball, thanks. And be like, good luck. Like, and not knowing, even in that situation, what I would have said as a white 16-year-old teenager, and your friend who you've been friends with since who knows for how long, or, you've played football with, or you've rode bikes with, or whatever it is. What do you say in that moment? What do you say as this kid? So I always like thinking about that part, because it really does sort of think, what it must have been like for Horse to be like, all right, well, now I have to go, I'm getting pulled from my house to go here, and I guess my friends can have my stuff. Like, so I always try to use like really small, I try to put as many small little details like that in through the book. And it's, sorry, one last thing, thinking about how I fleshed out the characters, was that the high school yearbooks were very helpful, but also like what the high school newspaper was sort of like, they would write stories, but then some of it would just kind of be like a gossip rag. So the players would come up sometimes in that too. And even just saying like, oh, is Babe Namora dating someone? Or so-and-so has like really nice legs, and things like that, that are just like, so much of it was like sort of written in the, the patois of the 1940s, where they would be like, so-and-so football player has great gams. But even that, you sort of get a sense that like, okay, these kids are trying to live some sort of normal life, despite the fact that they're 1,000 miles away from home. There's guns pointed at them all the time. They're behind barbed wire. There was some sort of levity that came with the newspaper in the yearbook. And then even how kids would sign yearbooks, the things that they would sign to their friends, like going through Babe's high school yearbooks from before he was sent to camp from Hollywood. I got a lot of the context of how he was treated on the team by his friends that were, they treated him like he was a football player. They didn't treat him like he was a Japanese American football player. So that helped me sort of understand his role and his context before he left for camp too.
Yeah, I think that there's that one article about jitterbugging that I love.
Yeah.
As an example of like, come on, Heart Mountain High School kids, we have to learn
Yeah.
how to jitterbug.
Learn how to jitterbug. Like, the jitterbug got so popular while they were in camp. And
Yeah.
that's like, I use that as an example because it's like the kids were, it was like, obviously they were just like, oh man, we got to do this. But then it was also like, there's this world that's still going on in America for other teenagers that these kids should have been a part of, that they've been completely removed from. So they've been removed from movies, they've been removed from their friends, they've been removed from, different kinds of roller skates that came out or whatever it is. And even it's just something as simple as like, oh, if we were back at Hollywood High right now, we'd all be jitterbugging, or if we were, in San Diego or whatever it is. So yeah, again, like reading through those high school newspapers and the yearbooks themselves were like so valuable in just finding those little details to fill it out.
Yeah, yeah. So I also want to ask you about the role of football in this book, even though, as we've said, it's about so much more than football. But how do you think about the ways that football and the other sport like basketball, baseball, all this sort of recreation serves as a stand-in in some way for a particular kind of American identity? Like how did you sort of approach the ways that football was maybe an Americanizing force for some of these kids, especially the Nisei kids, maybe before they were sent to Heart Mountain? And I don't know, how do you think about these players fitting into that framework? Maybe do you see that as a framework? And just what do you make of sort of football being the sport that you're talking about here, and being the one thing that the Heart Mountain High School team was better at than the surrounding schools they
Yeah. So I've spent a lot of time thinking about this, and I feel like I still don't really have a great answer because, coming into this story, that's what drew me to it, right? Is like the sort of like, you're like, a Japanese American football team, what? Like, but then once you start doing the actual research, the shock of that goes away and you realize like, okay, Issei were playing football in the United States in 1906. Like that's the first recorded version football game of Issei playing it. So that means that they definitely were playing football before the San Francisco Examiner started walking around writing about them playing football. So when you think about it that way, you think, oh, okay, they're part of this broader history. And there's a guy named Joel Franks who's written a great sort of historic book about Asian Americans in football. And he traces the history back really far and goes through like newspapers and says like, this kid was playing for Phineas Banyan High School in Long Beach in 1926. 3 years later, there's another Japanese American playing for this high school. It's incredibly thorough. So that was really helpful for me. But also, I think baseball came to Japan and developed in Japan at about the same time as it did in the United States. So for Issei coming to the United States, baseball was not some new sport that they had to learn. They knew it, they could play it, they'd already played it, they were familiar with it. Where football was this completely new sport. So when, generationally speaking, once the Nisei generation was born, a lot of their families did view, it's not monolithic, but a lot of their families did view football as this more Americanizing force, as something that, and even actually, if you look at it in this way, in that the Nisei Athletic Union very rarely had football teams. They had basketball teams, baseball teams, softball, weightlifting, volleyball. They had all these other sports, but football was still priority, mostly a priority in the white and black neighborhoods in Los Angeles and up and down the coast. So that's why you really don't have too many Japanese American players, even before the war, on many high school football teams. So Babe was on the Hollywood High School football team. George played on the Mountain View High School team. But then when the 40 players that showed up on the very first day of tryouts for the Heart Mountain Eagles, only 3 of them had ever played high school football before. So, you think about that and you think like it still hadn't exactly found its way completely into the Japanese American society on the West Coast at that point. And I mean, some of it was still, the Nisei generation was only one generation removed from a diet standpoint in terms of a fully Japanese, mostly vegetarian and fish-based diet. So you had very little dairy, and size-wise, that generation of Japanese Americans were still much smaller than the average white American at that point. When I first wrote that part of the book, my editor was like, all right, we got to be really like careful how, and I was like, I completely agree. I was like, so I was in like deep historic document records for like heights and weights for various ethnicities. And I was like, I feel like I'm in a really dangerous place here in terms of like white supremacy and phrenology. Like, I feel like I was right on the edge of like some weird stuff, but I knew that I had to find a way to say that generationally speaking, this generation, the first generation of Japanese Americans, was physically still smaller than their white counterparts, because it played out on the football field. It played out on the football field, and that every game the Eagles played there outweighed by their opponents, in some cases by up to 40 pounds per average per player. And that's a lot of the times why there weren't that many Japanese American players that played in high school. Like George and Babe were two of the biggest players on the Eagles, and that's why I think they were able to play in their public high school teams too. Because football, for the most part, until the Heart Mountain Eagles came around, really was still a game based predominantly on size, and just sort of, it was this game where it was a very slow game at the time, and everyone just sort of smashed into each other until eventually someone plopped into the end zone. But then, not to get too far ahead, but that was what the Eagles did so well, was that they said, okay, look, we're a lot smaller than all of our opponents, but how do we take that disadvantage and turn it into an advantage? And that's what they did by running a very fast offense. They utilized their small size by being on defense, by being able to get through the line and block a lot of punts and do a lot of and sack the quarterback a lot. They also weren't as tired because they were in great shape and they were smaller, so they were able to play a much faster game. They were quicker than their opponents. So that's how I always think about the Eagles, when people always say like this Americanism that they supposedly that I think a lot of people try to ascribe to the team. I had to sort of find a way to balance it. But then when I asked Kiichi Ikeda about it, he was like, no. And I had tried to ask him like in a couple different ways. I was like, did you guys feel like you were playing for something like bigger than the team and for this camp and for, sort of identity wise? And he's like, no, we were just playing football. And I was like, and sometimes you just kind of have to say like,
Right.
Okay, like maybe my opinion or my view of this is wrong, but maybe that is exactly how Kiichi or Babe or Horse or Stan or Taser or any of these players felt in that moment. But I think also through the lens of history, we could say maybe there was something else going on here that that the people, the 5,000 fans were feeling as they were watching these young men play that maybe the team didn't recognize in the moment, but I think is pretty evident in the, like, looking back.
Yeah, and I think there's something that's sort of symbolically beautiful about they won by playing their own style of football.
Mhm.
Like they played a version of the game that these other teams couldn't, and that's what made them win. And not to, lean too much into that, but I do think you've talked about sort of bringing in the draft resistance story too. And I think there's an interesting link there to think about with this sort of their own brand of the game of football, and then this sort of trying to articulate perhaps a version of Japanese American citizenship that, for a long time, these draft resistors were pushed outside of the community or sort of seen as not going along with the heroism and the patriotism of the 442nd. And more recently, there's been this, ability within the Japanese American community and beyond it, thanks to a lot of great scholarship, to embrace what these draft resistors and no-nos and others who sort of fell outside that main narrative were doing, either as a matter of survival or to sort of say like, wait a minute, this is not what we think it means to be American, or this is not what citizenship means. So I'm wondering, that's a long-winded way of getting to this question. How did you sort of balance these stories of patriotism, this very fraught idea, generally speaking, but especially within Japanese American history, but talking about, football games and then folks not resisting the draft or not showing up to their induction physicals? How did you sort of approach that part of the storytelling here?
Yeah, what I really tried to do in that moment was rely on the individual characters to tell the story and not have me saying, oh, what these guys are doing is actually pretty brave, guys. Like, to sort of let the reader know, like, okay, here's what, Frank Amy or like all these other people are doing from a draft resistance standpoint. And then here's the people, like George, Babe, Stan, like they all go to their draft physicals, and what they did isn't necessarily isn't wrong. and trying to find a way to balance those individual, the different levels of loyalty. We have loyalty to ourselves, we have loyalty to our families, we have loyalty to Heart Mountain community, we have loyalty to the Japanese American community, we have loyalty to the American community. So as an individual, how did each of these young men make these decisions? And each of those decisions was really fraught, right? Like, am I disrespecting my family by joining the Army, or am I respecting my family by joining the Army? And that sort of back and forth, I found could only be told by saying it on an individual basis, and what each of these people decided to do with their time in camp and their time on Earth, really, like thinking about, and that was the hardest part for me to write, in terms of like wrapping my own head around it. And that was when I really started honing in on like that universality of the teenage experience. And as a teenage boy, like I still had to technically register for the draft, like when I turned 18. And I still remember like signing that piece of paper and being like, what am I doing? Like, what is this? But knowing like, all right, well, I guess I have to do this thing. And then like trying to take my thought of doing that, in my parents' kitchen in Hyde Park, New York, when I was 18 years old, compared to what these young men had to go through, and the forces that were pushing in on them to make that decision one way or the other. So like Teizo Matsumoto's brother resisted the draft. So he was like, oh, okay, I trust my brother. I respect my brother's decision. I'm going to follow my brother too and do this. Whereas George's mom was like, you should do this. And he was like, yeah, of course I should do this. So he went to his draft physical. So you have these sort of small conversations that are happening in the barracks with your family. And then you also have, the Fair Play Committee and their huge meetings and what those are doing and how those are influencing thought in the barracks and thought in camp. And then you have the WRA sending people in, there's spies in the community. It makes my shoulders go up thinking about the stress of what that must have been like, on top of the fact that you're in a camp, like you're in a concentration camp. So like, for me, it was just like the only way that I knew to tell that story was the way that I tried to tell the rest of the story once we got to camp, was through these individual people and their decisions and how their decisions affected themselves, but then also when it came to the Fair Play Committee, camp more broadly, and then obviously the other camps as draft resistance extended to those camps too.
Yeah, and I think I've spent some time going through some of the Heart Mountain Draft Resistors WRA files, and that I think is my main takeaway, is like there were some folks who were part of the Fair Play Committee and really subscribed to that and were, part of this movement. And then there were a lot of kids who made these choices for different reasons, for family reasons. There's this one kid I think about all the time who just like kept missing his physical because he was out on seasonal work, and then he got sent to prison too. And so there is,
my gosh.
like,
Yeah.
That poor kid, I can't think of his name off the top of my head, because he
my
fully
gosh.
intended to, be drafted into the Army, but he just kept missing the telegram.
Just getting like sugar beets, pulling sugar beets somewhere. Yeah.
Exactly. So I do think that's, and sort of giving that to readers as a like, I'm not making a grand statement about this. I'm telling you these individual stories, and you take from this what makes sense to you, or you just sort of sit with these questions too, because I think that's important with these stories.
Yeah, that for me, I think as I've matured as a writer, I've realized that readers don't need to get hit over the head with stuff. So like, they don't need to get hit over the head and say, this is the point. They don't need like the sentence that says like, hey, I think this guy's a racist. Like, you just give the audience is intelligent, and your audience for a book is going to be smart enough. If they're sitting down reading a book, they have come in with an expectation of that they're going to learn something from it. So I think that you can give people these characters and you can give them the facts that happen, and you could, people can suss out their own opinions about these people without you saying, this is a bad person, this is a good person, or, I don't know about that decision. Like you could just say, okay, here's the things that happen. You could just lay them out factually. And, I don't only say that as someone who views himself like as a journalist first and think about things somewhat objectively. Like I think about it as a person who reads and has a brain that says like, I prefer reading things that don't hit me over the head with the author's, sort of aside that's like, hey, you should really think that that guy's bad. And there were times where I felt like I had to take out, not necessarily a sentence where I would say something like that, but I was like, okay, my third straight example of a racist thing this guy did, I was like, I feel like people will get it after the first two, or like whatever it is. And even sometimes like taking down a little bit of like the gore level of some of the, unfortunately, of the Chinese and Japanese massacres, things like that, where I was just like, sometimes I was just like, this is too much. Like, I don't need, this is almost sensationalizing a story that doesn't need to be sensationalized because it's horrible enough on its own. So.
Right, which is another kind of fine line to walk of like, how do you make it clear that this was bad? Even life in camp, like it's bad without sort of going into this sort of voyeuristic whatever. But
right, yeah, it does become sort of like you said, like a voyeuristic, or like sort of like staring at a traffic accident. And I think that for me, it was also, there were times where I was like trying to show so much about the good things that people in camp were trying to do to better the camp, for the Japanese Americans who were in the camp, not the camp administration, obviously, but like the things. And then at one point I was like, have I tipped too far and not shown how bad camp really was, because I was trying to show the good that people were trying to do. So then I had to like add more bad stuff back in. So it was like, it was one of those things where I was just trying hard to like kind of balance what that is.
Right. Right. And that's sort of, I have maybe one or two more questions, and I know David Fujioka's put a few questions in, and other folks watching, if you have questions, please do get those in. But I think on this line of sort of thinking about how to show like the joy and the real pain and darkness that was also part of this history, I found the last chapter of the book particularly moving, and this idea of sort of tracing out lives after camp. And, that one little vignette about Moss, I think his name was, who wanted to yay and never did, and these kinds of stories. And even Horst talking about, his best friend dying when Babe passes away. I think that was just a really kind of beautiful way to trace out the afterlives of camp and the afterlives of the Eagles, and that this community of, high school kids sort of stayed in each other's lives in different ways. So I'm wondering how you, as someone who has spent so much time researching and getting to know these families and these people as best you could, how do you see these characters, or Babe and Horst and Keiichi and Stan, all these folks sort of making meaning out of their lives? Or what meaning do you think they made out of their time on the Eagles? Not that you need to, put words in their mouths again, but sort of what do you see as how they made sense of that particular period in their lives?
I think almost all of them did it in, like, from the research and from speaking with their families, in one of the most healthy ways I could ever imagine a high school athlete doing. None of them felt like they constantly like dwelled on it. There was nobody there that was like, I was the best person, like that. I never got a sense of anyone of having, I think they were all proud of who they were on the teams, but I think all of them in their own ways went about their lives. But I also think that was at the time like a very Nisei response to camp life, in that they got back to the West Coast and they had to start their lives over again. So there was very little time to revel in past glories on the football field. And so when I think about it that way, sometimes I think, okay, well, that's sad. Like, that's a sad thing, because they didn't get the respect and the pat on the back that they really deserved at the time. They definitely didn't get it in the state of Wyoming. Like, I write about it in the book, but almost no newspapers other than the Heart Mountain Sentinel wrote about the Eagles. They briefly would. None of the Eagles ever made an all-state, even honorable mention, even though they're the best team in the state, which meant that the newspaper columnists were just sort of dismissing them, and the coaches weren't voting on them. Teams voted to not play against them because the Eagles were too good. So you have this sort of thing where the Eagles at the time didn't get the respect that they deserve. And I hope that doesn't come across as me patting myself on the back and saying like, look at the respect I'm giving them. But like, I think that they really didn't in their time and for years after. The person who carried the Eagles torch the most was George, and that's because he became a newspaper columnist. So when you look at after the war, I would go through digital records for Rafu Shimpo and Kashu Mainichi and Nichibei, and any place that George would either write for or his column would end up in. And a lot of times he would write about Babe and write about the Heart Mountain Eagles, and that was where their legacy really lived on, was in the Japanese American press, up until the point where when George was later in life and his columns were online. So I was able to read online columns that he was writing, and not just, he, in the early 50s, when he became a columnist for Kashu Mainichi, I was reading about Babe and Moss and Kichi when they were, in their 20s, and what they were doing on the baseball field in rec leagues around Los Angeles, which was, not a lot of that got into the book, but it was, for me, it was so fulfilling to see these men have a semblance of their regular lives. And for me, that was always hard to think about, if, this 3-year chunk of their life hadn't been ripped out, what their lives would have been. And there's other things that I had to be really delicate in writing about, like when Horst says he would have never left the farm if it wasn't for camp, and he ends up living in Los Angeles, becoming a newspaper columnist and traveling the world, working with different sports organizations. And he says that would have never happened if I had never been sent to camp. And like, how do you balance that? And I figured out by balancing it by just quoting his own words and being like, this isn't me saying this. This isn't me saying that his life was better because he was in camp. But there were certain situations where I did sort of run into that, about how to balance someone's opinion that is clearly goes against the grain of how we think about Japanese American incarceration today, and how broadly the Japanese American community thinks about incarceration. And for me, I sort of wiped my hands of it and just said, George, you could put it in your own words in the book.
Right. But that's something I've heard from, other musicians in particular who are part of like the George Igawa Orchestra at Heart Mountain, who say, I would never have sung in front of a big band in LA. I would never have been good enough. I wouldn't have been able to for so many reasons, but I got to because of this, or I got to go to college because of this, or whatever.
That's
so
college is the big one. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that even though, you do sort of like, oh, okay, I don't know if this is what we want to be saying, but you can't erase what people feel about their own experience. Yeah, and
exactly.
And important to include. Okay, so I have taken up all of your time, but we do have some questions from David.
I'll sit here all night. So
great, I have more. So David asks, does any video footage exist of the football games at Heart Mountain? It's a great question.
If it does, and no one's given it to me yet, please do. I've never been able to find any, unfortunately. But which is hard to like think about, but there's very little video of Heart Mountain that exists. And that's why the photo collections were so important to me. It's just sort of being able to get a sense of uniforms, what the field was like, how many fans there were lining the field, even the setting of the field, where the field was. I would have to go through old Heart Mountain maps and try to like find where it was and where that lines up to this day, which is how you get at the very end of the book, like me realizing that like that one tree, the only tree is like where the Hart Mountain football field was. But yeah, so much of the stuff that I wish could have been in video was just me trying to replicate that out of images that I was able to find. And honestly, the best thing in terms of not having video was how thorough the Hart Mountain Sentinel's game recaps were. Just incredible. Like every play-by-play that comes from that is in the book comes from the Sentinel and the Hart Mountain Echoes, which was the high school yearbook, or excuse me, the high school newspaper. And the book would have been impossible to do without that, and impossible to make those football chapters be good at all.
And they're fun. I mean, you do feel like you're, watching a game through reading a
Oh,
book.
good. Yeah.
But it's a sort of bittersweet, funny thing to think about, like 4,000 people watching a high school football game. Both that was the big event, but yeah, those kids were playing for quite an audience. And
it would have been bigger than any game. There weren't 4,000 people even coming to the Hollywood high school football games, which was one of the most famous high schools in the country. So like, and I say it in the book, but before Hart Mountain existed, like there was never permanent settlement on that piece of earth. So when you have 4,000 people there, like there have never been 4,000 people on that piece of land in human history. And that's the kind of stuff I think about when I think about the reality and what like the historic perspective of what, not only what these kids did, but then what that camp's existence on that piece of earth really means. And it's still, the fact that like the only time there's ever been a permanent settlement on that piece of land is when it was a concentration camp is really hard to think about,
Right. And
like the land didn't have to be cleared of other homes to build this.
Right. And that when you go there now, it's very difficult, I think, to look at Hart Mountain today and imagine, or the space that was Hart Mountain, and imagine 10,000 people living there.
It's impossible.
Yeah. So it does give you a sense for like what that would have meant to the community surrounding, to all of a sudden have this city, like the third largest city in the state, just pop up there. Yeah. So
I mean, and the camp now would still be one of the 10 biggest cities in Wyoming, which is like crazy to me that the state still hasn't really grown that much.
Yeah. And I think some of the work that Hart Mountain has done, and that's happening in scholarship and communities, to sort of also think about other folks who were removed from that land, like namely the Crow and the Upsaloka, and what that history means too, and what it means to have this concentration camp built on land that was cleared of previous inhabitants and then cleared again. And there's so many threads to get into, but it's powerful to be there. So to sort of wrap us up, I want to bring in David's other question, and a question of my own too, which is, what has the response been to this book? This is not exactly David's question, but kind of. What kinds of conversations have you had, and what do you think has been have been some of the main takeaways from folks who've read your book or listened to the audiobook, as I did this week, which is fantastic?
Yeah, the audiobook is great. And again, other than the words there, Fyodor did everything. It's really great if people are more interested in the audiobook, that is just as much of reading this book as it is if you flip through the pages. The response has been pretty overwhelming, honestly, especially from the Japanese American community. I wrote this book ideally for a wider audience, but every day thinking about how it would be received by the Japanese American community and the Hart Mountain community and the families of these players. And that response from the families, from the Hart Mountain, and from the Japanese American community in general has been more positive than anything, honestly, anything I've ever worked on. And it's kind of hard to think about sometimes without getting emotional, because you work so hard to make sure you don't screw something up, that sometimes you sort of get in your own way, and you sort of spend so much time thinking about how you might screw something up that you hope that you're not sort of sabotaging your work by being too cautious, or by being sort of tiptoeing around something that you really just want to say. And I think eventually I just sort of said like, okay, I know that the work I've put into this and the research I've done speaks for itself. And I hope that the readers think the same thing. I got an email once from someone who was at Heart Mountain, was in the Heart Mountain camp, and said that it was the most accurate and the best book they'd ever read, about the subject. And that was just, I just cried. Like, because, the Japanese American community and the Heart Mountain community has welcomed me so much, as someone who's not a member of this community, even a member adjacent to this community. So to get that response from the Japanese American community was really all I wanted. Was all I really cared about in the end, was that if this community felt respected by the work that I put into the book, nobody else had to read it. Everyone else could have hated it, but if this community thought that I had done a good job and done a respectful job, that I would have walked away feeling that like I had done something successful. So to have people from the broader American community and in New Zealand and in England and all these other places reach out to me and say that they enjoyed the book, has been, obviously the thrill of my professional life. And personally, it's just been a subject that has become really personal to me in terms of how I try to live my own life, how I try to speak with people about this subject. Since the book came out, or I guess since I finished writing the book, I've had the ability to write a few stories about it for the New York Times, not about the book, but about broader Japanese American life at the end of the war and then after the war, which means that it's reaching a different audience. This story of incarceration is now reaching an audience of the New York Times. And hopefully soon I'll be able to actually give more details about how it may be on a screen somewhere. So yeah, that process is just taking forever. But it's hopefully in the next couple of weeks we'll finally be able to say it. But then, if it does become a movie or it becomes a TV series, then this story of Japanese American incarceration will then reach an even broader audience, not just the story of the Eagles, but then reach an audience of people who haven't picked up the book, or haven't seen it in a library, or haven't seen it in a Barnes and Noble. And then I feel like that's the dream, is to have as many people learn about this history as possible. And that's why I've never said no to literally any interview about this, any interview, any event. Like I was saying before we went on, like I talked to random Rotary clubs. I do presentations to random Rotary clubs about Japanese American incarceration now. I do like one a week, spend an hour of my week doing it. And I walk out and I say, like, okay, maybe 30 more people know a little bit more about this subject than when they showed up at their Rotary Club meeting this week. And that's just become really important to me, even beyond the book. And especially in those Rotary Club presentations, like half of it is just Japanese American history. And then eventually I'm like, okay, here's the football stuff that you actually probably are interested in.
Right, the Trojan horse approach.
Yes.
Yeah, no, honestly, as I was returning to this book this week, I was thinking like, this would make a great movie, or this is a movie I would watch. Be great. So that's exciting. We'll wait to hear that news.
See. Yeah.
But I think the care and the relationships that you built in writing this book are very evident in reading it, which makes it feels like a personal story, even as you're going through a lot of this history. And so I think there's a lot to be taken out of this, thinking about other stories that we can, all of us here watching, can write or think about, or ask our parents and grandparents and neighbors about, that there's a power to hearing a multiplicity of voices in how we think about history. And I think this book is a really fantastic and powerful example of it. I'm looking over here because I have it next to me.
Oh, thank you. Well, I have it right here.
Oh yeah, yours is floating.
So I try to do like a very tasteful, like one copy, as opposed to like stacking like a dozen, because then people are like, he's just desperate.
Right, or he's not selling any because they're all in his house.
They're all in his house. Yeah. So the one thing I'll end on, when you talked about hopefully like more people tell the story, is that everyone can tell your story. Like everyone, you don't have to be an author, you don't have to be a journalist to like tell either your story or your family's story, no matter what that story is, whether it's about incarceration or anything. And that's what I always try to impart on people, is that I don't have some magical skill set that allowed me to do this. It's just anyone can write, anyone can research, anyone can find their family history, and these things are important. And it's important for us to know our own personal histories, our country's histories, our city's history, and anyone can do it. It doesn't have to be published. You could write it down, you could put it in your computer, you could do whatever with it. But I think that especially as newspapers continue to shrink, and our news gathering resources continue to shrink, that personally we're each a little bit more responsible each and every day to like keep the stories of our families and our communities alive. So that's my weird plug at the end.
No, it's the perfect plug. I make that plug all the time. So thank you. Yeah, and thank you so much, Brad. This was so much fun. Thank you to folks behind the scenes, everyone joining in. I will make one more plug for JANM. One of the exhibits up right now, A Life in Pieces, that's about Stanley Hayami and his diary. Joy has informed me or reminded me that his diary does talk about football at Heart Mountain. So if you're looking for more, go to JANM.
It's cited in the book.
There you go.
Yeah. And talk about like high school life. That's another thing I should mention, is reading Stanley's diaries was very important too, because he gave sort of the rhythm of high school life and sort of the anxieties of high school life. So I don't directly like quote his diaries, but they're definitely throughout and they're cited in the back. And I'm sure the exhibit's great because his diaries are super fascinating.
Yeah, it is an awesome exhibit, and talk about like new technologies in museum and artwork. It's fantastic. So if you haven't gone and you're in the LA area, definitely go. But with that, thank you so much. Thank you, Joy. I'm going to toss it back over to you, but thanks so much everyone for watching. And if you haven't, pick up your copy of The Eagles of Heart Mountain at the JANM store.
Thank you, Erin, and thank you, Brad. Yeah, I just hope everyone at home is joining me in a round of applause for this wonderful conversation. I had so much fun and learned so many things. And Grace, who's one of our JANM volunteers, also put in the chat that she's a JANM volunteer and still learned a lot about Japanese American history due to your research. So high praise from Grace.
Yeah, my brain doesn't even compute that. So thank you.
But yes, please purchase the book and visit our the exhibition. There's also lots of resources about Stanley Hayami's diary, and which is a core part of our collection, and the exhibition available online as well. So even if you're calling in from other places, and we're crossing our fingers also that it will travel to places like Heart Mountain, so more folks will be able to experience it. So with that, thank you so much. We hope to see you at other upcoming programs, and stay connected, and have a really great and safe rest of your weekend, everyone.